The silence that followed the crack of bone was absolute. 282 soldiers stood frozen in the Afghan dust, their breath visible in the dawn air, watching as Colonel Marcus Garrett crumpled to his knees. His right arm hung at an impossible angle, the sound of his whimper cutting through the mountain silence like a blade. Above them, the rotor wash from an incoming Chinook scattered sand across the formation, but not one soldier moved. Not one soldier looked away from the woman standing over their commanding officer. Captain Vesper Ghost, Nakamura hadn't moved from her position of attention. Her flight suit was pressed, her posture rigid, her dark eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the perimeter fence. The only evidence of what had just transpired was the slight displacement of dust around her boots and the way Garrett's service pistol lay 15 feet away, where it had skittered after flying from his hand. She had disarmed and neutralized a superior officer in less than 2 seconds, and now she stood as still as a statue while he writhed in the dirt. "Medic," she called out, her voice carrying no emotion, no satisfaction, no regret. Just the flat efficiency of someone reporting a mechanical failure. "Colonel requires immediate medical attention for what appears to be a compound fracture of the radius and ulna." The formation remained frozen. Somewhere in the ranks, a young private's radio crackled with incoming traffic from Bagram, but even that seemed muted against the weight of what they had witnessed. This wasn't supposed to happen. Colonels didn't try to strike captains. Captains didn't break colonels' arms. And Ghost Nakamura, the pilot they whispered about in mess halls, the one who had earned her call sign by vanishing into impossible situations and emerging victorious, didn't make mistakes. But Colonel Garrett had made one, a big one. 3 minutes earlier, he had stepped out of his command vehicle with the swagger of a man who had never been told no by anyone wearing fewer than 4 stars. He had marched up to Ghost with his chest puffed out, and his finger pointed like a weapon, screaming about insubordination and proper channels, and how dare she request an immediate dust-off for wounded Marines without his explicit authorization. The entire base had watched him advance on her, spittle flying from his lips as he berated her for going over his head to division. She had stood there and taken it. Every insult, every threat, every degrading comment about women in combat roles. She had absorbed it all with the same stoic expression she wore when threading an Apache through Taliban fire. But when his hand had moved toward her face, when that meaty palm had started its arc toward her cheek, something ancient and unforgiving had awakened behind her eyes. Now, as the medics finally broke from their shock and rushed toward the colonel, Ghost allowed herself the smallest of breaths. She had served in 3 theaters, flown over 600 combat hours, and saved more lives than she had ever counted. But this moment, this crystalline instant of absolute consequence, would define everything that came after. The war in Afghanistan had been raging for over a decade when Captain Vesper Nakamura first set foot on the tarmac at Forward Operating Base Wildcard. She stepped off the transport with the same measured pace she brought to everything, her flight bag slung over one shoulder, her helmet tucked under her arm like a basketball. The heat hit her immediately, that dry, consuming warmth that seemed to leach moisture from your lungs before you could even take a full breath. Around her, the controlled chaos of a military base in a combat zone unfolded with practiced efficiency. Mechanics swarmed over a damaged Black Hawk near Hangar 2, their tools catching the morning light as they worked to patch bullet holes in the fuselage. The smell of jet fuel mixed with dust and something else, something organic and unsettling that every veteran learned to recognize but never spoke about. In the distance, the Hindu Kush mountains rose like ancient sentinels, their peaks lost in a haze that could have been clouds or smoke. Ghost had requested this assignment specifically. While other pilots were pulling strings to get stationed in Germany or Japan, she had filled out the paperwork for Afghanistan with the same methodical precision she brought to her pre-flight checks. Her commanding officers back at Fort Rucker had questioned the decision. Why would someone with her test pilot credentials and perfect safety record volunteer for a deployment that was already winding down? Why would the daughter of a Medal of Honor recipient choose the most dangerous posting available? She never gave them a real answer. How could she explain that she needed to prove something that couldn't be measured in flight hours or evaluation scores? How could she tell them about the weight she carried, not just of her father's legacy, but of every doubt, every whispered comment, every raised eyebrow that followed her through 20 years of military service? Lieutenant Colonel Hayes met her at the flight line, his uniform bearing the kind of fade that came from months under the Afghan sun. He was younger than she had expected, maybe 35, with the lean build of someone who had learned to survive on MREs and nervous energy. His handshake was firm but not performative, and when he looked at her, she saw something she wasn't used to: simple professional assessment without the underlying current of skepticism. "Welcome to paradise, Captain," he said, gesturing toward the row of aircraft baking in the sun. "Hope you're ready to get your hands dirty." Ghost followed his gaze across the flight line. 3 Apache sat in various states of maintenance, their angular profiles looking predatory even at rest. Beyond them, a pair of Chinooks dominated the heavy lift area, their twin rotors folded back like the wings of sleeping giants. But it was the smaller aircraft that caught her attention, a modified Kiowa Warrior that looked like it had been through hell and kept flying. "That one yours?" she asked, nodding toward the scout helicopter. Hayes smiled, and for the first time since her arrival, Ghost detected something that might have been warmth. "Was. She's yours now. Maintenance chief says she's got about 300 hours left in her, but I've been flying her for 8 months and she hasn't let me down yet." Ghost walked toward the aircraft with the slow deliberation of someone who understood that machines could sense hesitation. The Kiowa was smaller than what she was used to, more agile but also more vulnerable. Bullet holes in the tail boom had been patched with aluminum plates, and someone had painted kill marks along the nose, small silhouettes that represented enemy vehicles destroyed. But it was the name painted just below the cockpit that made her pause. "Banshee," she read aloud. "Previous pilot's choice," Hayes explained. "Irish kid from Boston. Said she screamed like a banshee when she dove." His voice carried the weight of past tense, and Ghost didn't ask what had happened to the Irish kid from Boston. In a war zone, past tense usually meant only one thing. She ran her hand along the aircraft's skin, feeling the slight texture where patches had been welded over damage. This machine had history, scars, stories that would never make it into official reports. In 6 hours, she would be taking it into combat, trusting her life to its engines and rotors and the skill of mechanics she had never met. But standing there in the Afghan heat, watching dust devils dance across the airfield, Ghost felt something she hadn't experienced in months: anticipation. The briefing room at FOB Wildcard smelled like stale coffee, and the kind of nervous sweat that came from too many people making life-or-death decisions in too small a space. Ghost sat in the third row, her notebook open, her pen moving in efficient strokes as Major Patricia Voss outlined the tactical situation. Around her, 24 pilots and crew chiefs leaned forward in their plastic chairs, their attention focused on the map projected on the wall. "Grid reference 41 SPR 1234-5678, Voss continued, her laser pointer tracing a route through the mountainous terrain east of the base. "Intelligence indicates high-value target movement through this valley between 800 and 1200 hours. Primary objective is reconnaissance and target identification. Secondary objective is close air support for ground units if contact is initiated." Ghost studied the topographical lines on the map, automatically calculating approach vectors and escape routes. The valley was narrow, bordered by ridges that rose over 8,000 feet above sea level. Any aircraft operating in that environment would be channeled into predictable flight paths, making them vulnerable to ground fire. It was the kind of mission that separated experienced pilots from dead ones. "Weather report shows clear skies with winds from the southwest at 15 knots, gusting to 25, Voss continued. "Visibility unlimited. Temperature at mission altitude will be approximately -10 Celsius. Be advised that enemy forces in this area have been equipped with man-portable air defense systems. A few pilots shifted in their seats at the mention of MANPADS. Shoulder-fired missiles were the great equalizer in asymmetric warfare, cheap, portable, and devastatingly effective against helicopters. Ghost had faced them before, in Iraq and Syria, but the threat never became routine. Every mission carried the possibility of a bright flash and sudden silence. "Captain Nakamura," Voss said, her voice cutting through Ghost's tactical calculations. "You'll be flying reconnaissance in Banshee. Call sign Ghost 16. Your mission is to establish an observation post on the North Ridge and provide overwatch for ground elements advancing through the valley." Ghost nodded, making notes about radio frequencies and emergency procedures. Around her, she could feel the attention of the other pilots, the subtle weight of being assessed and measured. She was the new arrival, the unknown quantity, the one who would have to prove herself all over again in an environment where mistakes were measured in body bags. "Weather window opens at 7:30, Voss continued. "Flight time to target is approximately 45 minutes. You'll be operating with minimal support due to ongoing operations in Sector 7. Questions?" The room was quiet for a moment. Then Chief Warrant Officer Danny Rodriguez raised his hand. He was Apache qualified, with the kind of confidence that came from surviving multiple deployments. "Ma'am, what's the backup plan if Ghost 16 encounters technical difficulties in that terrain?" Voss glanced at Ghost, then back to Rodriguez. "Nearest emergency landing zone is 12 kilometers south of the target area. Ghost 16 will be equipped with survival gear for 72 hours. Any other questions?" There weren't any. In a war zone, you learn to accept that some missions carried inherent risks that couldn't be mitigated by planning or preparation. You simply did your job and trusted that your training, your equipment, and your instincts would be enough to bring you home. As the briefing broke up, Ghost remained in her seat, studying the map one final time. She traced the route with her finger, memorizing landmarks and identifying potential hazards. Tomorrow morning, she would fly this mission alone, threading a vulnerable aircraft through hostile territory while enemy fighters potentially tracked her movements through rifle scopes. It was exactly the kind of challenge she had come to Afghanistan to face. Ghost had earned her call sign during her second deployment to Iraq, though the story had evolved through so many retellings that the truth had become secondary to the legend. Some versions claimed she could make her helicopter invisible to enemy radar. Others insisted she had once vanished from a Taliban ambush only to reappear behind enemy lines 10 minutes later. The reality was both simpler and more complex than the mythology suggested. Her given name was Vesper, chosen by parents who had met at a military ball and fallen in love over shared stories of night flying. Her father, Master Sergeant James Nakamura, had been a crew chief on Huey gunships in Vietnam. Her mother, Captain Alina Rodriguez, had been one of the first women to qualify as a Navy test pilot. They had understood, perhaps better than most, that their daughter would inherit not just their combined passion for flight, but also the burden of proving herself worthy of the legacy they represented. Vesper had soloed at 16 in a Cessna 172 at a civilian airport outside Sacramento, where her father worked as a flight instructor after retiring from the Army. She had earned her private pilot license before her driver's license, and by the time she graduated high school, she was already accumulating hours in everything from gliders to vintage warbirds. Her parents never pushed her toward military service, but they didn't discourage it either. They simply provided opportunities and let her choose her own path. The call sign had originated during a mission over Fallujah in 2006. Ghost was flying a Kiowa Warrior on a reconnaissance patrol when her aircraft suffered a catastrophic hydraulic failure at 4,000 feet. Standard procedure called for an immediate emergency landing, but the only suitable landing zone was inside a neighborhood known to be crawling with insurgents. Instead of following protocol, Ghost had used the aircraft's auto-rotation capabilities to glide 15 kilometers back toward friendly territory, managing power and airspeed with the precision of a surgeon performing brain surgery. She had disappeared from radar for 8 minutes during the emergency descent, vanishing into ground clutter and radar shadows while she fought to keep the aircraft airborne. When she finally emerged from behind a row of apartment buildings and touched down safely at a forward operating base, her wingman had thought she was dead. The radio had been filled with frantic calls and search coordination, but Ghost had simply keyed her mic and announced her safe landing with the same calm professionalism she brought to routine training flights. Ghost 16, how copy? Her wingman had transmitted, his voice tight with disbelief. Lima Charlie, she had replied, using military shorthand for loud and clear. Ghost 16 is on deck and secure. Request maintenance team for hydraulic system inspection. The incident report had noted her exceptional airmanship and calm under pressure, but it was the radio recording that had spread through pilot communities across 3 services. That 8-minute disappearance, that impossible glide back to safety, had transformed Vesper Nakamura into Ghost. The name stuck because it captured something essential about her flying style: the ability to appear where she wasn't expected, to survive situations that should have been fatal, to accomplish missions that existed in the gray area between possible and impossible. But nicknames in the military were double-edged weapons. Ghost carried respect among aviators who understood the skill required to earn such a reputation, but it also carried skepticism from those who preferred their heroes to be more conventional. Some commanding officers saw her as an asset, others saw her as a liability. Some fellow pilots sought her out for advice, others avoided her entirely, as if her presence might somehow jinx their own chances of survival. Standing on the flight line at Fob Wildcard, watching the sun set behind the Hindu Kush Mountains, Ghost understood that Afghanistan would be her final opportunity to define what the name meant. She was 38 years old, with over 4,000 flight hours, and a service record that read like an adventure novel. But she was also a woman in a profession that still questioned whether women belonged in combat roles, an officer whose unconventional methods had earned her both medals and reprimands. The pre-flight inspection took 45 minutes, longer than Ghost usually spent on routine checks. But Banshee wasn't routine. She was a combat veteran with her own scars and stories, and Ghost believed that aircraft, like people, required patience and respect. She checked fluid levels, examined rotor components, tested control responses, and reviewed emergency procedures with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood that complacency killed more pilots than enemy fire. Chief Warrant Officer Maria Santos, the maintenance chief, watched from a respectful distance as Ghost worked her way around the aircraft. Santos was a 20-year veteran with grease under her fingernails and the kind of practical wisdom that came from keeping helicopters flying in impossible conditions. She had maintained aircraft for pilots who treated machines like rental cars and pilots who spoke to their helicopters like beloved pets. Ghost clearly belonged to the latter category. "She's got her quirks," Santos called out as Ghost examined the tail rotor assembly. "Tends to pull left on takeoff if you don't compensate for torque. Main rotor wants to hunt at cruise power. You'll need to stay active on the collective. And the radio's got a short in the headset jack. Sometimes you'll lose comms for a few seconds." Ghost nodded, making mental notes about each potential issue. In combat aviation, survival often depended on understanding your aircraft's personality, its strengths, weaknesses, and the subtle ways it communicated distress or satisfaction. She had flown helicopters that purred like cats and others that fought her every control input. Banshee would be somewhere in between. "Previous pilot leave any notes?" Ghost asked, running her hand along a patch on the fuselage where enemy rounds had been stopped by armor plating. Santos smiled, the expression carrying equal parts affection and sadness. "Lieutenant Murphy was old school, said the aircraft would tell you everything you needed to know if you bothered to listen." She paused, then added, He wasn't wrong. Banshee brought him home from 7 combat missions before. She didn't finish the sentence, but Ghost understood. In a war zone, every aircraft carried the ghosts of previous crews, the accumulated weight of missions flown and battles survived. Some pilots found that history comforting, others found it oppressive. Ghost had always fallen into the first category. She preferred aircraft with stories, machines that had been tested under fire and proven their worth. The final item on her pre-flight checklist was weapon systems. Banshee was equipped with a .50 caliber machine gun mounted on a swivel system that allowed the pilot to engage targets while maintaining flight control. It wasn't the heaviest armament available, but it was versatile and reliable, perfect for the reconnaissance role she would be flying. Ghost checked the ammunition feed, tested the targeting system, and verified that the safety mechanisms were functioning properly. As she completed her inspection, the call to evening prayer echoed across the valley from villages beyond the perimeter. The sound was haunting and beautiful, a reminder that this was someone else's homeland, that the conflict raging around them was part of a story larger than any individual mission or deployment. Ghost had learned over multiple tours to find peace in that reminder. War was temporary. The land endured. Tomorrow she would take Banshee into combat for the first time, threading through mountain passes where enemy fighters might be waiting with rocket-propelled grenades and machine guns. She would fly alone, beyond the range of immediate support, trusting her skills and her aircraft to accomplish a mission that could shift the tactical balance in the region. But tonight, standing on the flight line as stars appeared in the clear Afghan sky, Ghost allowed herself a moment of simple appreciation for the complexity and beauty of the machine that would carry her into battle. At 5:30 hours, the alarm in Ghost's quarters pierced the pre-dawn darkness with its electronic shriek. She was awake instantly, her body conditioned by 20 years of military service to transition from sleep to full alertness without the luxury of gradual awakening. Outside her window, the base was already stirring. She could hear the distant rumble of generators, the hydraulic whine of equipment being tested, and the muffled conversations of night shift personnel preparing to hand over operations to the day crews. Ghost dressed in the methodical manner she had perfected through countless combat deployments. Flight suit first, each zipper and Velcro closure checked and secured. Then boots, laced with the precision of someone who understood that loose equipment could become fatal distraction in an emergency. Finally, her survival vest, loaded with emergency radio, first aid supplies, water purification tablets, and a Beretta M9 pistol that she hoped never to use but had trained with extensively. The mess hall was nearly empty at this hour, inhabited only by night shift personnel grabbing coffee before heading to their bunks and early risers preparing for dawn missions. Ghost collected her usual pre-flight meal, black coffee, wheat toast, and a banana, and found a table near the window where she could watch the flight line. In the distance, mechanics were already swarming over aircraft, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they conducted their own pre-flight inspections. She ate slowly, using the time to review her mission parameters one final time. The valley she would be observing was designated Objective Rainbow, a stretch of terrain that intelligence believed was being used as a transit route for high-value targets moving between Pakistan and operational areas inside Afghanistan. Her job was to establish an overwatch position and report any movement, providing real-time intelligence to ground units positioned to intercept. The mission was classified as low to moderate risk, but Ghost had flown enough combat hours to know that risk assessments were educated guesses at best. Enemy forces had proven remarkably adaptable, and what looked like routine reconnaissance on paper could transform into a running gun battle without warning. She would be flying alone, beyond the range of immediate support, in terrain that offered limited options for emergency landing. If something went wrong, she would have to solve the problem herself. At 6:45, Ghost made her way to the flight line for her final pre-flight inspection. Banshee sat exactly where she had left her the night before, but in the pre-dawn darkness, the aircraft looked different, more predatory, more purposeful. The mechanics had completed their own checks and signed off on the aircraft's readiness, but Ghost would conduct her own inspection regardless. She had learned early in her career that pilots who trusted others with their lives rarely lived long enough to regret the decision. The inspection revealed nothing unexpected. Oil levels were proper, control surfaces moved freely, and the weapon system responded correctly to test inputs. Ghost strapped herself into the cockpit with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual hundreds of times, adjusting seat position, checking harness security, and verifying that all emergency equipment was within easy reach. Ghost 16 Tower, came the voice in her headset as she completed her engine start sequence. You are cleared for departure on runway 27. Wind is light and variable, altimeter 2997. Tower, Ghost 16 copies all. Departing runway 27 for objective Rainbow. The takeoff was smooth, Banshee lifting off with the eager response of an aircraft that had been designed for this environment. Ghost climbed to 3,000 feet above ground level, high enough to clear the surrounding ridges, but low enough to avoid detection by long-range surveillance systems. Below her, the Afghan countryside spread out like a topographical map, all browns and tans broken by the occasional green line that marked a river or irrigation canal. As she flew east toward her objective, Ghost monitored multiple radio frequencies, listening to the controlled chaos of a military base coordinating dozens of operations simultaneously. Transport aircraft reported their positions, ground units requested supply drops, and somewhere in the electronic background, the constant whisper of encrypted communications that carried the most sensitive intelligence. But as the distance from base increased, the radio chatter faded until she was flying in relative silence, alone in the cockpit with only the rhythmic beat of rotor blades and the whisper of wind across the canopy. This was the part of flying she had always loved most, the solitude, the sense of being suspended between earth and sky, the knowledge that for these moments she was completely self-reliant. The approach to Objective Rainbow required careful navigation through a series of valleys that twisted between peaks rising over 10,000 feet above sea level. Ghost flew low, using terrain features to mask her approach while simultaneously watching for threats. At this altitude, in this terrain, there was little margin for error. A mechanical failure or enemy contact would leave her with seconds to react and limited options for escape. As she rounded the final ridge before her observation position, Ghost caught her first glimpse of the target valley spread out below her. It was narrower than she had expected, maybe 2 kilometers wide at its broadest point, with steep sides that would channel any movement along a predictable route. The terrain was perfect for an ambush, either against ground forces moving through the valley or against aircraft attempting to provide support. She established her observation post on a rocky outcropping that provided clear views of the entire valley while offering some protection from ground fire. Ghost shut down to minimum power, reducing noise and heat signature while maintaining the ability to depart quickly if the situation deteriorated. Then she settled in to wait, watching the valley through binoculars while monitoring radio frequencies for any indication that the mission parameters had changed. In the silence that followed engine shutdown, Ghost could hear the wind whistling through the mountain peaks and the distant call of a bird of prey circling somewhere above her position. This was Afghanistan in its most elemental form, ancient, unforgiving, and beautiful in a way that photographs could never capture. For the next 6 hours, this would be her world. 2 hours into her observation, Ghost detected the first signs of movement in the valley below. It began as a glint of reflected sunlight from something metallic, barely visible even through her binoculars. She adjusted her position slightly, using the aircraft's optics to get a better view, and gradually began to make out details that made her pulse quicken with professional interest. A convoy of 3 vehicles was moving through the valley, staying close to the northern wall where rock formations provided concealment from aerial observation. The lead vehicle appeared to be a Toyota pickup truck, ubiquitous in this part of the world and impossible to distinguish from civilian traffic at a distance. But the second vehicle was different, larger, more purposeful, with what appeared to be radio antennas that suggested communication equipment beyond what farmers or merchants would require. Ghost keyed her radio to report the contact, but instead of the clear signal she expected, she heard only static. She tried again, switching to her backup frequency, but the result was the same. The radio short that Chief Santos had mentioned was apparently more serious than advertised. She was effectively cut off from base, observing what might be a high-value target convoy without the ability to call for support or guidance. Standard operating procedure in this situation was clear: maintain observation, attempt to reestablish communications, and avoid engagement unless directly threatened. But as Ghost watched the convoy navigate through the valley, she realized that once these vehicles reached the far end of the pass, they would disappear into terrain where finding them again would be nearly impossible. If this was indeed the high-value target that intelligence had predicted, this might be the only opportunity to track their movement. The third vehicle in the convoy was the most interesting. It was a modified SUV with what appeared to be armor plating and blackened windows. As it passed directly below her position, Ghost could see armed figures in the vehicle's cargo area, their weapons held with the casual familiarity of experienced fighters. These weren't farmers or merchants. This was exactly the kind of convoy that justified her presence in this valley. Ghost made her decision with the cold calculation that had characterized her entire military career. She would maintain observation for as long as possible, documenting the convoy's route and composition. If communications could be reestablished, she would call for intercept teams to move into position. If not, she would follow the convoy at maximum distance until she could determine their destination, or until fuel considerations forced her to return to base. She started Banshee's engine with minimal power, just enough to maintain flight control while reducing noise signature. The convoy was approximately 2 kilometers ahead of her position, moving at a steady pace that suggested they were confident in their security. Ghost began to shadow them, using terrain features to mask her movement while maintaining visual contact. As she followed the convoy deeper into the valley system, Ghost noticed details that increased her certainty that this was a significant target. The vehicles maintained precise spacing and formation discipline. The armed personnel were alert and professional in their posture. Most importantly, they were following a route that avoided known checkpoints and observation posts, suggesting detailed knowledge of coalition force dispositions. 3 kilometers from her original observation post, Ghost attempted to contact base again. This time, she managed to establish a weak connection, though the signal was broken and difficult to understand. Base, Ghost 16, in contact with, convoy of 3 vehicles, grid reference. The transmission dissolved into static before she could complete the report. She tried twice more, but the signal was too weak and unstable to carry detailed information. Ghost was on her own, shadowing what appeared to be a high-value target convoy through increasingly complex terrain, with no way to call for backup and a fuel supply that was steadily diminishing. It was exactly the kind of situation that separated competent pilots from legendary ones. The convoy's route began to make tactical sense as Ghost continued her pursuit. They were following a path that would take them to a known border crossing, where they could disappear into Pakistani territory beyond the reach of coalition forces. If that happened, weeks of intelligence gathering and preparation would be wasted. More importantly, whatever operation these individuals were planning would proceed without interference. Ghost found herself facing the kind of decision that defined military careers. She could break off pursuit, return to base, and file a report about probable enemy movement that had been lost due to communication failures. It would be the safe choice, the defensible choice, the choice that would protect her from criticism if something went wrong. Or she could continue pursuit, accepting increased risk in hopes of gathering intelligence that might prove decisive. The choice, when it came, felt inevitable. Ghost had not volunteered for this deployment to play it safe. She had come to Afghanistan to test herself against the most demanding challenges military aviation could offer. This convoy represented exactly the kind of target that justified her presence in this valley, in this country, in this war. She adjusted her course to parallel the convoy's route while maintaining maximum distance consistent with visual contact. Her fuel gauge showed sufficient reserves for another 90 minutes of flight time, which should be enough to track the convoy to their destination and return to base. But fuel calculations in mountain flying were notoriously unreliable, and the margin for error was shrinking with every kilometer she flew deeper into hostile territory. As if responding to her thoughts, Banshee's engine began to develop a slight roughness that hadn't been present during her pre-flight inspection. It wasn't serious yet, just a barely perceptible change in the engine's rhythm that suggested developing mechanical issues. Ghost immediately began calculating alternative courses of action, emergency landing sites, bailout procedures, survival protocols. In her experience, aircraft rarely failed catastrophically without warning. They usually provided subtle hints that something was going wrong, and pilots who ignored those hints rarely lived to make the same mistake twice. The convoy reached a junction where the main valley split into two smaller passes, one leading north toward Pakistan and the other turning west toward a region known to house Taliban training camps. For a moment, the vehicles paused at the junction, and Ghost could see figures dismounting to consult what appeared to be maps or communication equipment. Then, to her surprise, the convoy split up. The first two vehicles turned north toward the border crossing, following the route that intelligence had predicted. But the third vehicle, the modified SUV with the armed personnel, turned west into terrain that would take it deeper into Afghanistan rather than toward sanctuary in Pakistan. This was an unexpected development that changed the entire tactical picture. Ghost faced an impossible choice. She could follow the majority of the convoy toward Pakistan, where they would likely escape, but where her presence might at least confirm intelligence predictions about enemy movement patterns. Or she could follow the single vehicle heading west, into territory where a lone helicopter would be extremely vulnerable, but where the intelligence value might be significantly higher. The engine roughness was becoming more pronounced, and Ghost's fuel situation was approaching the point where she would be committed to whatever course of action she chose. There would be no opportunity to change her mind once she selected a target to follow. In the cockpit of an aging helicopter, flying alone through hostile territory with failing communications and developing mechanical problems, Ghost prepared to make the kind of decision that would define not just this mission, but her entire legacy as a combat pilot. The decision crystallized in Ghost's mind with the clarity that came from 20 years of military training. The SUV heading west represented the greater unknown, and unknowns in intelligence work often proved more valuable than confirmations of existing assumptions. She banked Banshee toward the Western Pass, committing herself to a course of action that would take her deeper into hostile territory, while her aircraft developed increasingly obvious mechanical problems. The Western Valley was narrower than the main pass, with steep walls that rose nearly vertically on both sides. Flying through this terrain required constant attention to wind patterns and potential downdrafts that could slam an aircraft into the valley floor without warning. Ghost reduced her altitude to just above the deck, using the valley walls to mask her presence while maintaining visual contact with the SUV below. The vehicle was moving faster now, as if the occupants sensed they were being observed. Ghost could see the distinctive dust plume created by its passage, and occasionally she caught glimpses of the vehicle itself as it navigated around rock formations and dried creek beds. The route they were following wasn't marked on any map, but it showed signs of regular use, a smuggler's trail or infiltration route that had been worn smooth by repeated passage. Banshee's engine roughness had progressed from a subtle vibration to a noticeable shudder that Ghost could feel through the airframe. She began mentally reviewing emergency procedures while simultaneously calculating distance to potential landing sites. The nearest known friendly position was 40 kilometers behind her, but there were several areas in the current valley that might be suitable for an emergency landing if the situation deteriorated further. 15 minutes into the pursuit, the SUV stopped in what appeared to be a prepared position, a circular clearing surrounded by rock formations that provided natural defensive positions. Ghost could see figures dismounting from the vehicle and taking up positions that suggested they were expecting contact. More concerning, she could see the glint of what appeared to be heavy weapons being unloaded from the vehicle's cargo area. She climbed slightly to get a better view of the situation, and what she saw made her reassess the entire mission. This wasn't just a convoy moving personnel or supplies. This was a prepared position, possibly a staging area for operations against coalition forces. The level of organization and equipment visible in the clearing suggested this was a significant enemy asset that had been hidden from previous surveillance efforts. Ghost attempted once again to contact base, but her radio remained frustratingly unreliable. She managed to transmit a few broken words: Ghost 16, enemy position, coordinates follow, before the signal dissolved into static. She had no way of knowing whether any of her transmission had been received or understood. As she continued to observe the enemy position, Ghost realized that this discovery justified the risk she had taken to follow the SUV. This was exactly the kind of intelligence that could shift tactical balance in the region. But without functioning communications, she was the only person who knew this position existed, and her aircraft was showing increasing signs of mechanical distress. The engine shudder was accompanied now by a subtle but noticeable loss of power. Ghost's training told her she had perhaps 20 minutes of flight time remaining before the situation would become critical. She could return to base immediately and hope to arrive before mechanical failure forced an emergency landing. Or she could continue observing the enemy position, gathering intelligence that might prove decisive, but accepting the risk that mechanical failure could force her down in hostile territory. The choice was complicated by movement she detected on the ridge lines surrounding the enemy position. Through her binoculars, Ghost could see additional personnel taking up positions that suggested this was more than just a waypoint or temporary stop. This appeared to be a permanent installation, possibly a command post or supply depot that had been established specifically to support operations in this region. As if to confirm her assessment, Ghost observed what appeared to be communication equipment being deployed in the clearing. Large antennas were erected with military precision, and she could see personnel working with equipment that suggested sophisticated electronic capabilities. This wasn't just a tactical position. This was a strategic asset that could coordinate operations across a wide area. The intelligence value of her observations was increasing by the minute, but so was the risk to her aircraft and her own survival. Banshee's engine was now producing irregular power fluctuations that made stable flight increasingly difficult. Ghost found herself constantly adjusting throttle and collective inputs to maintain position, and she knew that this level of mechanical degradation typically preceded complete failure by a very short margin. She made her decision with the same cold professionalism that had characterized her entire career. She would continue observing for 10 more minutes, documenting everything she could see about the